welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. We're continuing our series looking at the Gospel of Luke with a bit more of a political lens and to see how Jesus fits in politically and socially into his context. And rather than sort of extract everything and interpret everything through a very a lens of hundreds of years of Christian history, we're trying to look at Jesus with a mind to more of the past of the people who were interacting with him. If you want to catch up on some of the previous videos in this Luke series, you can find that on YouTube and Facebook. There's also a few videos before we got into Luke that help set up some of the context for what we're looking at in these. There's some videos on some texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls and from the book of Maccabees and different things like that that help give a flavor for what we're looking at this sort of time. We're looking today at Luke chapter 6, but I'm only going to look at the first half of chapter 6 because the latter half of chapter 6 is what we call the Sermon on the Plain, which is the accompaniment or sort of match up to the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew, which is the more common sermon that we use when we do this sort of thing. The Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain are probably from the same sayings of Jesus, but Luke definitely records them in a little bit of a different way that I think is really important for us. And I want to spend more time unpacking what that is. And so we'll get to that next week. And so for this week, we'll focus on the first half of chapter 6, which also has some really interesting and important things. So I didn't want to combine them because it would just be too long of a video for this evening. So last week we looked at questions of fasting and Jesus healing and some questions of Jesus's identity. He forgives sins rather than heals. Forgiving is something only God can do. He refers to himself as the bridegroom, which was an image for God in a relation to Israel. And so there's some of that was coming out last week. And so we've moved from this question of divinity and who Jesus is in terms of identity when he does miracles. And we're going to continue with some miracle stories, but the identity, it's a shift in what the miracles are telling us, that rather than Jesus's identity as God, to some questions of authority and law and this sort of idea that the Pharisees were making everything about particular obedience. So let's get into the first half of chapter 6. One Sabbath, while Jesus was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked some heads of grain, rubbed them in their hands, and ate them. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And so this is not something that extreme. It's not like they were literally doing work. They weren't out fishing or anything on the Sabbath, but they were going through grain fields and they plucked some heads of grain and were doing this to get the edible bits out of it. And that would have been considered a bit too much under the very particular ways of following the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees called Jesus up for this. And remember, up to this point, Jesus has been pretty careful about not doing things that intentionally would make people angry. So even though he is challenging some of the ways of being that are quite legalistic, as we would refer to them now, or taking the law and twisting it to make it more about, again, obedience than about relationship to God and how God relates to us. He's been quite careful about that. But in this instance, the disciples are doing something that does make people angry, and the Pharisees call him out for this. Jesus answered, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.'" So this is really interesting for a couple of reasons. First, he uses scripture to argue against their use of scripture, essentially. They're saying you're not following the law. And he says, well, surely, I mean, you can see other stories in these own books you have where um, people make decisions, people that you revere make decisions that might violate the law, but they are justified. And this was an accepted way of arguing in that sort of rabbinic way of debate about certain things. You could argue with a story from the Bible against the actual laws of the Bible to say, yeah, the law says this, but surely we should be a bit more aware of this sort of thing. And there's other places in the Gospels where Jesus talks about going and, if someone is in trouble, if you have your child or one of your cattle or something falls down a well, would you not get it out and rescue its life? Because surely its life is more important than keeping a law on the Sabbath, and those sorts of arguments. But here he argues from a specific story from the Old Testament about David actually not just rubbing grain or eating grain on the Sabbath, but actually going into the house of God, into the tabernacle, and eating the bread of the presence, which would have been much more of a no-no than Jesus's disciples just taking some grain and rubbing them between his hands. But then he says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And maybe in a future video, I'll do more on that title, the Son of Man, because there's a lot to unpack with the title of Son of Man and a lot of debate around that. But the quickest answer and the most apparent that is most accepted is that the Son of Man is Jesus referring to himself. And it's a reference to a bit of a apocalyptic kind of sense of God coming to earth. And the Son of Man is a character from Daniel 7 who is part of God's action to save the world and restore Israel. So that's part of where that title is. And so he's here even setting up himself as Lord of the Sabbath, but he doesn't still want to break these laws. But the Son of Man as Lord of the Sabbath is a very strong thing. It continues on. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and taught, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath so that they might find an accusation against him. And now at this time, the healing or doing minor sort of healings or miracles wasn't universally thought of as disobeying the Sabbath or violating the Sabbath, but some people did find that, and if he did it, they could try and argue against it, but it wasn't as accepted that it was against the Sabbath. But they're still looking for anything. Even though he knew what they were thinking, he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come and stand here," not violating the Sabbath. He got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to him, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to destroy it?" And this is a similar argumentation to the, if your child falls down a well on the Sabbath type of thing. After looking around at all of them, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and the hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So he confounds them because he's able to show very clearly, very apparently that their positions are ridiculous and wrong, and that their insistence on these little moral quibbles or ways of following the law and insisting on them and punishing them and doing all of those things is so against the character and the spirit of the law itself. So for us now, we often do this with a lot of rules, and you see this in many pockets of Christianity where little rules and little laws of morality and things that you can argue from the Bible or from Christian tradition become held up over and against the spirit of love and grace and welcome that is at the core of the gospel. And then what you end up with is a Christianity that focuses far more on peripheral rule following than the core of what the gospel message is. And so a lot of the churches that I grew up in and was exposed to a lot through different camps or different trips or just people that I knew growing up in America, there are a lot of churches that really begin to hyper focus on these things where it's, you don't swear or you don't be seen drinking alcohol. And these things become idolatrous to the point where people would rather do serious harm to other people and be rude and quite nasty people often, but they tell themselves they're good people because they might not swear or ever be seen with a beer in their hand. And it's ridiculous and it's idolatrous, and it is exactly the kind of thing that Jesus is skewering here and very clearly brushing away as against the spirit of who God is and how God relates to human beings. Then the story kind of moves on. The narrative shifts. Now during those days, this is verse 12, he went up to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. So at this point in Luke, we've had some calling of the disciples. And he's called a few specific disciples. He's called Levi, and he's called a few others, but he hasn't necessarily named them 12. So a quick note on the words disciple and apostle, and capital disciple, like capital apostle. So Luke talks about apostles. He also writes the book of Acts, in which the apostles are there. The word disciple means like student, and so you would have a rabbi and their disciples. So disciple for us has a very Christian-y sort of flavor these days, but it was a student. Your disciple was a student. And Jesus had many, what we would maybe refer to as lowercase d disciples, who were, maybe thousands of them at different points. Followers, students of his, who would travel around with him from place to place, and they kind of grow in number and shrink in number at different times, depending on whether what he's saying is really attractive or what he's saying is really difficult to follow. But there is a kind of lowercase d disciples, a group of them who are his followers, his students. And so he picks 12. And so in terms of the Gospels, we might refer to capital D disciples, the disciples, as the 12, which is, Peter and James and John and Philip and all of these people, including Judas Iscariot, who is one of the 12 disciples. Now, Luke makes a distinction here between the disciples, who he now calls apostles. And again, these aren't just titles, these are words. So he has a group of students. He picks 12 to be kind of special, and he calls them apostles. And apostles means ones who are sent. They are sent ones. So it goes from being a student to being specifically one commissioned or one sent out. And so the 12 apostles, who we refer to with a capital A, the 12 apostles, or sometimes even 13 apostles, because what you get, the 13 number, you have the original 12 disciples, Judas, no more, Judas Iscariot, no more. In the beginning of Acts, the apostles get together and they choose Matthias to join their 12, to make it up to 12, because again, it's the idea of the 12 tribes, and that number is important to them, and they want to have 12. And so they pick Matthias to come in and be the 12th. And then what they get then is Paul is later added as an apostle, and he calls himself an apostle, one not naturally born, is how he refers to himself. He's sort of added in later. He's not one of the 12 picked by Jesus, like here, where Jesus is specifically commissioning these people. Paul's added later to make the 13th apostle with a capital A. And that's just how we title it, because they are the specific ones that we're referring to. But apostle was just a general word meaning one sent out. You could have an apostle who you might send on your behalf somewhere else to do something specific for you. That was an apostle. And so here he picks 12, and there's a few lists of the 12 disciples or apostles in the New Testament, and they differ very, very slightly. So you have, in all of them, you have Simon Peter, Andrew, Peter's brother. You have James and John, who are the sons of Zebedee, and John is the beloved one. He's also mentioned in John. John doesn't have a list, by the way. And then you have Philip, you have Bartholomew, you have Thomas, and then you have Matthew, who's also called Levi at times, and we heard in Luke the calling of Levi. And then you have James, son of Alphaeus. You have Judas, son of James, or who's referred to here. And then you have Simon, who's called the Zealot or the Canaanian in Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark's lists are identical also. And then you have Judas Iscariot. And the difference you have between Matthew and Mark and Luke is that Matthew and Mark have Thaddeus, whereas Luke and Acts, which is, again, Luke is the same author, so of course he has the same list. You have Judas, son of James, so a different Judas. And so that's kind of the difference between them, is you have Thaddeus and then you have Judas mentioned, and is quite common in this day and age to have multiple names, to have nicknames. If you have a really common name, to sometimes be referred to as a different name. Judas was a very common name. John was a very common name. All of these are really, really common names. So it would have been pretty normal to have a couple of names that you were maybe referred to. So it's very possible that Thaddeus and Judas are the same person, because you would have had normal names. And if Judas is a really common name and you have two Judases, because you also have Judas Iscariot, you might end up calling Judas something different, like Thaddeus. Maybe, could be. But that's the one difference there between Luke and then Matthew and Mark's lists. And there he lists them. So I'll read Luke's for you. Now during those days he went up to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Simon, who he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who is called the Zealot, and Judas, son of James, possibly Thaddeus, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Dun, dun, dun. And then it continues on, and that's where we'll get to next week, with the beginning of the Sermon on the Plain, which we call because it says he came down with them and stood on a level place, whereas the Sermon on the Mount says he went up on a hill, on a mountain. But the sermon that follows is probably the same sermon. So we'll get to that next week. But very interesting stuff here with Jesus and his confrontations with the Pharisees over the Sabbath and what really is important, what really is at the heart of God and how God relates to humanity. Is it about, specific rule following and that's what's important, or is there something more important to the way that we love and that we care for one another as human beings? And for Jesus here, very clearly, he chooses love and caring for one another. So thanks for joining us this week. I know and I recognize that I was going a bit fast, talking a bit fast over a few things, but hopefully if you've been following along, you can see how these pieces start to fit together and how all of these things kind of coalesce to form more of a 3D picture of what's going on in the life of Jesus. I find it really interesting. I really like all of the stuff, and I hope that comes across, and I hope that you find it interesting as well. Thanks very much. Have a good evening.